Yeah, so it's a warm welcome from myself, Damion Wonfor. For those that don't know me, I founded Catalyst Wonfor and joined today by a dear friend of mine, Ruth, who I'll introduce in a short while. But just as always, as we start these sessions, just to remind you on some sort of housekeeping, really. So everybody is on listen only mode. We can't see you. And we will be trying to obviously make this some sort of discussion during the session. So please feel free to use the chat panel. I can see some of you already saying hello on there. But any reflections as we're working through the conversation we're going to be having around working with senior leaders in transition as a coach. Please feel free to add reflections. I will invite you to add some questions as we go through as well. But that would be our sort of mode of communication with the wider group. So when you're sending a question or reflection through, if you just select send to all rather than sending privately to the panelists, and then it just means everybody can see everybody's questions as they're coming through. Session will be recorded, so it will come and appear on our YouTube channel where all our past webinars are. So please feel free to go back and watch it afterwards. And as always, I'd encourage people to shut down any other applications. Yes, that helps with focus and means that we can be present, but also it just stops any impact on the transmission speed in terms of your broadband width as well. And finally, the session today will be sort of 30 minutes to 45 minutes max, depending on the questions that come through as well. So let me just introduce Ruth Simpson. Just in terms of the expert that I'm talking to today. So Ruth is an executive coach, a facilitator, consultant, and is also completing her PhD research as well, which links nicely to the topic that we're discussing today. But all of Ruth's work and research has really focused on enabling people to adapt and respond. And for those that joined the webinar that we ran earlier this year on adaptability and resilience, you may remember Ruth from that session as well. So thank you so much, Ruth, for giving us your time today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me back.
And I've got a few questions that I want to ask Ruth. It's this topic as well has been something for me that's always sparked an interest in terms of how organizations are supporting leaders in transition. And I think coaching is such an underutilized resource in this area, because often there may be assumptions that are being made that the leader's been successful in the past and so will be successful again. So I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation today, Ruth. And I know we've had a brief conversation around some reflections that we've both had just to form a structure for today's conversation. But again, I'm just going to pause here and just invite any other questions from the audience in terms of, as you're listening to today's session, where's your interest around this topic as a coach? What would you like to hear from the conversation Ruth and I are going to have? So please feel free just to add some questions in there. It's lovely to see people joining from different parts of the country as well as internationally. So yeah, please feel free to add some questions through. Any questions you'd like to ask just around coaching senior leader transitions? Yeah, thank you, Nora. We're going to talk about this piece, I'm sure, of uncertainty and, like you say, in the wider context at the moment. Yeah, thanks, Kev. So, is there a secret to senior leadership transition? There's definitely a difference, and we'll talk about that. And then from Kim, anything specifically around COVID-19. Yeah, how to help them when they're so keen to appear in control. Yeah. There's some really good questions coming through. Okay. Thank you. We'll reflect on those questions as we're working through the conversation. So Ruth, let's just start with a broad question, just to take us into this context, really. What when you think of the senior leader transition, what makes the transition into a senior leadership position, I think, so important, or just an issue, sometimes?
Yeah, sure. It's, as with a lot of things, a number of different things coming together which makes this an issue. If we look at it from a contextual point of view for organizations, this is an issue in terms of cost and impact on the organization. I've posted a blog on the website. Damien's put it up there, and that has the figures too. But just to give you an idea, there's a figure that sort of 30 to 50% of leaders fail within the first 18 months of taking up a new role, which is quite a staggering figure, especially when you think about all the money that goes into recruitment and development of talent. And then when it comes to a transition, there's a huge risk of failure. Someone made the point about impact. There's been some work done that actually up to 12 people are affected by a failing leader, in the sense that their performance is not what it could be. Their performance is significantly affected, as they say. So, in that sense, the organizations are really suffering. What's interesting is the lack of response. There was some research in 2006, and 50% of people in the survey said support was not managed well for leaders moving into a transition. By 2014, there was another survey of leaders, and 90% said transition development could still be improved. So there's a recognition that the impact on the organization is significant, and the response seems to be lacking, in that leaders and HR people, community don't think that the support is there when needed. But there's another reason, and I think something that came to me through my practice of the year, and personally, I'm sure we're all aware of the hidden costs of the challenges associated with a senior leadership position. No one records how the impact that it has at home, both on the leader personally, but also on their families and their friends and their lives. So it's one report has suggested that transition anxiety comes only second behind divorce. So it is an issue for the organization. They're not necessarily responding, and there's also some hidden costs that aren't even being recognized. So that's what makes it such an issue.
Yeah, and I mean, so I was just going to quickly just reflect back, because I've seen some reflections coming through on the chat panel. So we'll make sure that the link to the blog that Ruth wrote on this topic is sent round to everybody afterwards, and that will make reference to the research that Ruth is referring to. I mean, I really sort of align what you're saying. I remember seeing a study, and it was probably a good 10 years ago, by the Global Research Council, and they were saying that for senior leaders in transition, the team members of that leader will be underperforming as much as 50% to the peers, in other teams as well. So there's a systemic cost in terms of this lack of support as well. And when let's just go a bit more into the transition itself, in terms of what makes the senior position different in terms of the transition.
It's probably key at this point as well to talk about what makes a senior position. It's such a broad term. What I'm defining it as is that shift when suddenly the accountability is increasing, when you're making that move perhaps from functional area of expertise, maybe where you've had that kind of operational responsibility, to suddenly that step up towards strategic responsibilities. And maybe leading change. So that's the position that I'm talking about. In terms of the challenges, I see three kind of challenges, and then there are three things that don't help. first challenge is the task, what they're actually having to do. As we've said, the position itself is away from operational to strategic. So all of a sudden there's letting go all of the things that you used to do. Well, not all of them, but certainly a large proportion of them. Perhaps you have to delegate these to other people in favor of learning to do something new. So you're out of your comfort zone and you're learning to do new things. At the same time, you're looking at different people and different relationships. So whereas you've transitioned before and you may be used to letting go of things and learning new things in its place and learning to work with new people, at a senior level, the issue is those relationships are perhaps changing, both in terms of who they are, but also what you need from them, how to connect with people in a different way, perhaps your peer group, learning to work up, but also working to learning to work down the organization. So the task itself changes, the relationships change. And when you think about identity, we tend to identify ourselves by what we do and who we do it with. And when you're changing both of those, you're also changing, that's got an implication on how you see yourself. And again, whilst you might have made that transition before, at a senior level, so much more is up in the air when you're actually making that transition. So those are the kind of three challenges, if you like. And then I think things that don't help is the increased accountability. One leader I was working with, she said, I'm clutching on to an umbrella, and she was talking about it now, and the tension was really, really huge. This accountability for performance is quite huge. So the pressure comes there. And there's also a need for speed. I noticed someone's already mentioned on the chat panel this 3-month window. Michael Watkins wrote a book, The Critical 90 Days, how important it is to make a good impression. And that actually, some people suggest if you don't make a good impression quickly, then it's the end of your career. So you've got more accountability. You're hugely under the need to show results quickly. And then I think something else that needs to be considered, and often isn't, is where you might be in your life as a whole. If you look at lifespan theorists, theories of human growth and development, this kind of 30 to 50 window is quite key in terms of reappraising and modifying your beliefs. So you go through childhood and early adulthood and you're kind of working out how the world works. And then there's a natural phase when you're kind of challenging and questioning some of that because you've had that experience to underpin it. So just at a time when professionally your identity may be changing, there's also natural growth that would say, well, which way's up? So all of those things together make it quite a challenging point.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And I just seen a reflection come through from Kizzy about imposter syndrome, and confidence. This is, when you look into this, I always see that confidence is one of those things that leaders talk about that often goes. And looking at some of the research around if a senior leader position actually takes 18 to 24 months in reality, just that sort of sense of, well, where do they go to talk about these challenges? Like you're saying, this sense of, who am I being now? What's required of me in this new role? How do I manage these relationships, like you're saying? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think the imposter syndrome, the talent curse, this is often really key, especially when people have done quite well through life. They got through school, they got through university, they got their first few jobs, first few years, and suddenly this is the first time they're starting to struggle. And the smarter they are, the harder they fail. And how can you really, you've got there by being bright and knowing stuff, and all of a sudden you don't know. And maybe we'll pick that up on in terms of COVID a bit later on, but it is suddenly, well, I don't know how to perform, because I always have done in the past. So I think that plays a really big part. People that seem to be better able to deal with this have probably overcome some pretty huge obstacles earlier on in the career. So they're used to coming back from it. But for some people, especially in the professional services, in law, some of the really fast moving organizations, they have never struggled before, and it is a real shock because they just don't know what to do.
Mm. So let's just perhaps talk a bit, because there's some reflections coming through about supporting leaders. We'll pick up some of the other questions about different types of transitions perhaps a bit later. But so what can coaches do then, Ruth, just in terms of to help?
Well, just before we specifically talk about that, I think it's really useful to understand the transition process. So based on my research so far, I've been kind of trying to really understand this psychological process, what actually happens as we kind of adapt into this new role. Could we show the slide that we've got, Damion? Okay, so this is why I couldn't just talk through this. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Bridges' work into transitions. As he defined it, the letting go, the neutral zone of chaos, and then the new beginning. Now I'm doing my PhD studies. I'm understanding more about where it's coming from, and originally the work into transitions was based on rites of passage, and this kind of 3 phase, so starting from letting go, and then the betwixt and the between phase, and then integration. Those can be mapped directly to sort of Bridges' work, but what I'm finding is that actually there are 2 steps before which are really too. This first one, anticipation and expectation, is really key when you're coming into the senior leadership role, because it's often perhaps you're coming in with your views on what a leader is, and those are often informed by your background. I was working with one leader who was really struggling because he'd grown up in the Northeast. His father was a miner, and the managers or leaders were not good people, and here he is in his role as a leader. So there was a real tension there in terms of his anticipations and expectations of leadership that he was bringing in. So what you believed before is really important, and what you think a senior leader role will be. And then there's this encounter point, and this is where you've taken up the role and you're actually sitting in the chair, you're doing the job, and it's when does this encounter happen in terms of this, what I thought was going to happen and what is happening is different. And some people, I think, don't get to that point. I think in some transitions, they just push on through. They just ignore the messages. Perhaps they don't have an awareness. Maybe they're getting some good results, so they can just ignore that encounter and just push on through. My hypothesis is that that will come and get them later on in their career. And perhaps some of the challenges that people have later on are because they didn't deal with some of this at the first leadership transition. So there's that real encounter. And with that encounter comes a choice. Okay, I need to be different. And that largely means letting go, separating from the old roles, stop bringing the old beliefs, the old ways of doing things. And then this period of disorientation. Bridges' term natural zone of chaos is brilliant, because it does sum up this topsy-turvy, I'm neither one thing or another. And the point is here, this is a period. And you mentioned 18 months, 3 years. I haven't found anything that tells you how long this transition is going to take. It is a period of disorientation. And I think experimentation and testing are the 2 key things that will define it in terms of what are you trying to do differently? What are you having a go at? What assumptions and beliefs are you challenging? And then only when you've got through that, and do you find some clarity around the way you're thinking and acting and identifying yourself, are you perhaps heading towards the end of the transition? The key point, I think, for me is that it's a unique journey for each leader in terms of what they become aware of, have the courage, energy and motivation to work on. So once, you know, as I say, for some people, maybe they just skip the letting go betwixt and between and think, yeah, I am now a senior leader. I would challenge, perhaps there's some thinking to be done at some point, and if you don't do it now, you do it later on. Damion, any questions on that, having gone through that? Anything that you can see that else that needs covering?
Oh, I suppose it's making me just reflect further on this whole piece of the reflection of the leader, you know, when often, especially at that level, it's more sort of doing and deciding. If you think about pace, I just picking up on the bit I saw Claire sort of reflect earlier, you know, about the expectations the leader have of themselves and how that sort of impacts them. I would suppose it was also making me think in this initial phase about the expectations of others, you know,
yeah,
and just the impact that has on the leader.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I suppose I was just curious in terms of your research around this, and you know, and again, I know it's early stages for you in terms of this, just but how often people are actually taking the time to work this through, Ruth?
Well, you know, I mean, one of the reasons that when we were talking about figures from reports from CIPD, this is a hugely under-researched area. There really isn't a lot of work. I think someone did a PhD last year, found 11 evidence-based studies about transitions. So we don't, you know an awful lot about kind of what goes into it. Sorry, I've completely forgotten. What was the question you asked me?
I was just saying, just on your experience so far, have you met many leaders that have taken the time to really work this through, you know?
Oh, well, this is what's fascinating. You know, I'm in the process of looking for leaders who've worked with a coach through this transition. And obviously a lot of us coaches know that because we've worked with them. But outside the world of coaching, so many people don't come anywhere near looking at this. So it would be a great question. I would love to know what percentage of senior leaders go through a transition without any kind of support at all. I think what's really important to mention is that getting through a transition, it's quite a long journey, and who knows what is going to influence at the time. You know, all the leadership development work will help, you know, individual learning will help, and you kind of never know. I think the key determinant is enabling those people to be aware that something is not as good as it could be. And I think once somebody's realized something could be better, then they'll kind of start down the track and find the best way as possible to address that. But you know, I would love to see some research that finds out how many people go through this and when. Yeah, it would be great.
Mm-hmm. So how about coaches then, in terms of supporting this, Ruth?
Okay. Well, if we go, I think, to the next slide, we can talk about how coaching can help. So as I've said before, I think this is really unique for every individual. I think up until the senior leader role, perhaps there's an opportunity to take training at leadership development courses, you know, perhaps action learning, work with others to address some of the challenges you're facing. I think at the senior leadership position, it gets very personal, and what one person needs could be completely different to somebody else. I think it is a really holistic approach. I think it is life and work. When you look at the impact of leaders in terms of implementing change, driving change, mobilizing resources, developing people, that becomes more purposeful, and it's a combination of who you are as well as what you do. There is emerging evidence. There were 5 empirical research papers that talk about coaching and leadership transitions, and the evidence does show certain benefits. I think creating the space is the first one, because it's who knows what is going on for this leader. I think there is a risk sometimes, especially earlier on in the career. My background was, you know, consulting and leadership developments, right? Okay, let's talk about leadership. That may not be the case. And it's really important, I think, for coaches to be still and to see what the client is bringing. You know, they may come in with some very clear goals. This is what I want to do. And it's being able to really act as a mirror and feedback what you're seeing, because that may not be necessarily what is most relevant for them. So I think creating that space to see what emerges is really important. Obviously, developing new skills and capacities will definitely play a part, because it's about how you let go, delegate, influence at a different level. And then dealing with self-doubt and confidence building, as you mentioned, Damion, because again, you've got to this point and you're under pressure and suddenly, oh, can I do this? And as soon as you're starting asking that question, can I do it and am I good enough, you're going down that spiral. And then group coaching could perhaps recognize the relational value and the relational nature of transitions. Working one-to-one is fantastic for that individual, and obviously they'll be talking about how they're going to interact with other people. What group coaching does is put those discussions in as a kind of microcosm of the organization. So it recognizes the very relational nature of this transition, the fact that it's about people and it's about how you engage and connect with people as well. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I suppose first reflection in terms of the container and the space we're creating, you know, because for these leaders, where else are they going to have this honest conversation around what they're facing and these questions about who am I and how am I being? But I suppose the other piece, just picking up at the end, this idea of group coaching, and again, there's various definitions around what we mean by that, Ruth. So when you're talking about group coaching and working with leaders in transition, can you just say a bit more about what form that takes?
Yeah, again, a hugely under-researched area. Broadly, it's a group of, it's the pursuit of individual goals in a group setting, but it means very different things to very different people. There's no common way about how it's implemented or defined. And that's the purpose for the research, to understand a little more about what it does actually mean. As far as I'm understanding, what I'm thinking at the moment, it is creating that space in a community, and seeing what needs to happen within that. I was talking to someone yesterday and we were talking about it's provoking thought, because one of the things that perhaps leaders to this point have not really had to think, they've not really had to engage in anything. So if that's what coaching allows you to do, what if we can do that in a small community of people going through the same things? Because you're also then creating perhaps a network for the future. Perhaps you're starting to develop a culture where people can talk about that and share that. So that's one of the reasons to explore it. But when you look in the coaching textbooks, there's an increasing amount of literature on team coaching, and there seems to be clarity around the definition in coaching the team to achieve a common goal. Whereas group coaching, some people, when I've mentioned this, oh yeah, I do that all the time, do it with a group of 40 people on a webinar. Someone else, oh God, no, I wouldn't go anywhere near that. To be honest, I've got some real concerns about it. It's the same as my original questions about coaching. Is it HR on therapy? What is it? And part of the challenge is there isn't a neat definition, but what can we find out about it that's useful?
So in a way, I mean, having a group of senior leaders that are transitioning in a room with a coach who's facilitating it, this is just my reflection, a dialogue between them in terms of, their personal objectives, their challenges. There's that shared learning piece, isn't there? Like you're saying, it's in a way, it's I suppose really shifting the focus on leaders supporting their people in transition as well.
Yeah.
So I can sort of see that through the role modeling that will happen. Just in terms of there's this piece around confidence, and I can see a question's been asked around that. I mean, and again, Ruth, I know there's lots of things that we might be doing, but especially in transition, as a coach, what comes to mind for you in terms of how you work with that?
I think one of the first things is to normalize the situation. That actually we all go through transitions all the time. We leave home, we start a new job, we start a new relationship. It's a very natural process, and we do it without thinking in a lot of situations. But the very fact that we do it without thinking means when we come across one that's difficult, we don't know what's happening. And so I think one key thing you can do through coaching is to normalize it. Yes, this lack of confidence, this lack of self-doubt, do you think anyone else has ever felt like this? Well, oh, maybe they have. And I think there is a real temptation for some people. They just think, I'm the only one that feels this bad. I'm the only one that's struggling. And as soon as you can start to normalize the fact that everyone's going through this to a greater or lesser extent, and perhaps people that have had to go through some difficult transitions before, or really struggled before, they're going to find it slightly easier. But for a lot of people, as I said before, it's the first time they're really struggling. And so to normalize it will really help. I think, in terms of, on the next slide, I've kind of summarized some of the key kind of areas in terms of to raise self-awareness and develop leadership vision are also key. So people are hitting this, it's difficult, normalize it. Yes, this is perhaps what you're experiencing, and then people can find a bit of comfort in that. And then I think raising self-awareness is really important. People might have thought about things before, but to what extent? So feed forward, 360, psychometrics, depending on what they already know about themselves. And reflection as well. Can you hear me?
I just lost a bit of you there,
Okay.
Ruth.
Yeah.
After
Can you hear me?
feed forward.
Okay, yeah, so feed forward, 360 psychometrics, anything that will help people learn a bit about themselves if they don't know already. I think especially related to the changing nature of relationships, the development of emotional intelligence can be very helpful, and understanding different learning styles. And then again, depending on the knowledge, leadership models, even if people have gone through them before, perhaps they're looking at it in a new light. So situational leadership perhaps, but again, where the client is as to what's going to be most useful.
Thank you. And I appreciate the sort of maturity of the group that are listening, but just in terms of the word feed forward, just in case if everyone's not familiar with that concept, Ruth.
Yeah, this, I forget where it's come from in terms of the reference, but it's this idea about asking people, instead of just saying, well, how were they? My understanding is that 360s tend to be quite historical in terms of what people have done. What this is more asking about is understanding what this person could do to develop to be more effective. So perhaps a bit of understanding about what are their strengths, what do they bring to the organization, to you, what are the big challenges that they're going to be facing or you see they're facing, and what could they do to address these challenges and develop themselves. So it's much more forward focused development, and can put it in that frame, as opposed to looking backwards. But I'm sure, yeah, that's just a general term for it. Does that help?
Thanks, Ruth. And just a couple of, I suppose, other sort of reflections in there. So there's in the chat panel, there's a reflection about, says this, I suppose I'm just paraphrasing this, sort of the coach's role is to accelerate the transition. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I just wondered what your reflection would be on that.
Yeah, I think it would depend what you meant by accelerate. I think it depends where the client is, what the client has got the energy for. Mm-hmm. If they're up against it performance-wise, and this comes back to your three-way contracting with their boss, fundamentally, that's going to be very helpful because it's going to help focus you on what's really important and what's required. I'm not sure whether it's necessarily accelerating it, because these things do take time, and as I say, it depends what the energy is there for. If you've done the three-way contracting and it's very clear there's some performance goals that need to be met and the client is engaged in achieving those, then maybe it's accelerating the achievement of those. But in terms of accelerating the transition, it's very difficult to say when it's finished, and the time and energy that it takes to put in the reflection, to put in thinking, to really integrate at the end of the transition. I'm not sure whether you could necessarily accelerate and speed up the process. I think sitting with the process is the most important thing.
Yeah, and inviting it actually as the coach, because the leader, like you're saying, might have other areas they want to work on as well. So how about just anything for your research? And again, I've just seen some couple of reflections, any differences between the leaders, already they're already a senior leader and they're transitioning. Is there anything you've come across in terms of any differences?
Well, again, I think the key thing is it doesn't matter how senior you are. I've worked with directors who've needed a lot of education and normalizing. So even just because they're a director doesn't mean they've kind of gone through this before. So I think the level is irrelevant. It's how they've experienced transitions in the past and how much work they've put into those transitions. So I think it's less about the level and more about what the client needs and where the client is.
And how about in terms of specific challenges for women, Ruth? Because I know there's a lot of focus on the whole piece of diversity in terms of gender, but just anything you come across in relationship to that?
No, I don't think so. I think I've come across it with both. I mean, there is the standard comment that women tend to wait until they're ready for a position before they step into it, whereas a man will take it irrespective, and then think that they can deal with it. I'm not sure. I've worked with both men and women in these positions, and I think they both have it depends on the person as opposed to the gender, in my experience.
Thank you. So just Ruth, before I just I'm going to ask you about your research just in case people are interested, but just anything else you just want to add at this point, just in terms of anything else that we haven't spoken about that just feels important for you to share?
I think we've kind of covered the bulk of it. I love these comments, and I'm really sorry that thanks for sharing the reference Marshall Goldsmith. That's where Forward came from. I think picking up the point that Tony's mentioned about act like a leader, think like a leader. I think Ibarra's work's really interesting because she talks about possible selves, and that's the key part of in the betwixt and between phase of a transition. This is all that experimentation and testing. Instead of what we tend to do is, right, I'm planning to be this leader, so I'll do A, B, C, and D to get to it. Whereas actually it's much more about having clarity about the kind of leader you want to be and what sort of things do you need to do to get there, and trying different things as opposed to, right, I've decided this is my path. And I think that act like a leader, think like a leader really speaks to that. It's about doing different things. And if you want the next role above, then start acting like that now rather than waiting until you get in it, and that will all help with the transition, and certainly from the anticipation and expectation point of view. I do just want to say, for all of the questions, hopefully I think Damion will be able to send me the chat so I can see what the issues are, but I don't know how we could make that possible, but I'm really happy to take any questions or anything offline if we haven't covered anything after this webinar.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, so just in terms of your research, just because people listening I'm sure will be interested to see a bit more about what you're doing currently.
Thank you for asking. Yeah, well, so it is what I really want to understand is what can we do to improve practice around this area. I'm not suggesting that we're going to create any kind of silver bullet to this. I think it's the senior leadership transition, the way people go through it, as someone's mentioned, culture, it's dependent on so many different factors. The environment that they're doing it in, both at home and at work, and the people they're doing it with. But what I do want to do is just explore a bit about this in terms of what can group coaching bring to it. So I'm starting off now interviewing leaders and possibly the coaches that worked with them through the transition, to understand what actually happened from a coaching practice point of view. And then next year, I'm looking for organizations to work with to run a couple of action research cycles of leaders going through this transition to see what comes up as much as anything. It's not evaluative. I'm not going to pitch group coaching with one-to-one as someone else suggested. I just want to explore it to see what happens and comes up. So if anybody, any leaders out there would like to take part, any organizations think this would be interesting for them, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. So as Ruth said, we'll contact you afterwards for joining, and we're going to send you the link just to the blog that Ruth wrote on coaching senior leader transitions as well. Just to say, as we're closing the session today, we are doing another webinar tomorrow at 11:15 UK time. So I hope you can join us for that session. I'll be talking to my colleague Karen Prentice about her new book, working with the 5 seasons. So hope you can join that session as well. Really appreciate you joining and your engagement today, and look forward to obviously connecting with you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.